Okay, so last week, the magazine ELLE Canada put out a list celebrating 8 Canadian women, and within just a few days, that list became a gigantic site of controversy. It has raised a lot of questions about the responsibility of magazines. Today on the show, what happened with ELLE Canada's list? I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Okay, look, right now, if you go and pick up the September issue, this is a September issue of ELLE Canada, there's this great photo of Catherine O'Hara on the cover. It features this great interview with her. And then also in that magazine, you'll find an article featuring 8 Canadian women who are, quote, making changes for the better. The article, I should say, is also available online, except after this gigantic online backlash, ELLE Canada made a bunch of changes to that online version, and those changes are just not sitting right with people. To talk about all of this, Niko Stratis is here, Michelle Cyca is here, and Matt Amha is also here. Niko, Michelle, and Matt, welcome to the show, everybody.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, I'm glad that you guys are here. Listen, it's like customarily an opportunity for me to let you speak, but I got to do a bunch of talking. I got to set up this story, so I'm really sorry about that. But before we get into this conversation, I just want to take a moment to lay out briefly what happened on a timeline here. Last week, ELLE Canada published this feature that they do every single year of Canadians who are making a difference. In social media posts, they said, you know, these are 8 Canadian women who are changing Canada. It was meant to be this celebratory post. One of these women is Sarah Jama. She's an Ontario politician. She was once an NDP member, and now she sits as an independent. Sarah Jama has been contentious because she's had to apologize after some folks said that the statement that she put out after the October 7th Hamas attack didn't focus on the civilians who were killed in Israel and the hostages that were taken. In the ELLE Canada profile, she calls what is happening in Gaza a genocide, which is, of course, a word that has prompted a lot of intense debate. 2 other women on the list, Vivek Shreya and Faye Johnston. Vivek is an artist and Faye is an activist. Both are trans women. And then we get to this week. This week, ELLE's social media pages have been flooded, I would say, with all these responses about the inclusion of all 3 of these women. This article has gone through a bunch of changes, but the biggest change so far appears to be the removal of Sarah Jama, that politician that I just mentioned. There's a lot to dig into just there. Niko, maybe I'll start with you on this. What was your reaction as you saw all this mess, all the story kind of unfolding online?
A lot of confusion. I mean, you know, I had seen Faye post about it first, just because that is sort of my like immediate circle that it hit was, you know, other trans folks that I know, and I know Faye and I've worked together in the past, and so I saw, you know, posted about, oh, I'm on this list, and then sort of immediately it became this thing of like, oh, the wording has been changed, the post has been taken down, things seem to be moving, and like I don't spend a lot of time thinking about ELLE Canada, you know, like that is, to me, that is a magazine that sort of you see in the rack when you're in the grocery store, and like that's fine. I'm not denigrating that. I just like that's sort of what it is to me. So I was like, I guess I have to look up what ELLE Canada's up to, and then that's sort of when I saw the thing about Sarah Jama being removed, and then I was like, well, this feels wrong. And then I went looking for word from the publisher after that happened, and got no notes. Like 0 answer, no response at all. And I was just like, well, this feels bad, because when I first read it, she was on there, and then suddenly it was not. And so I was left really confused.
Yeah, the confusion is, I think, I would say, has been the primary reaction that I've noticed online. Is there's just like a lot of like, what do you stand by and what do you not stand by? And I want to sort of get into this a little bit. I want to talk about this note that was added to the online article. So first, initially, they had this disclaimer, okay, and the disclaimer said ELLE Canada has received some threats, so they've edited the online article to protect everyone involved. However, if you go and get the physical magazine, you can read the full article in the magazine. That note also added that, look, you know, since the writer of that article didn't approve of the changes, didn't make the decision to make those changes, her name was also removed from the piece. But then a second disclaimer gets added, Michelle. And this disclaimer still has the part about the threats, still has the part about how the writer's name was removed. But then it contains this new thing. It contains more loaded language. It now subtly says, this original article represents the opinions of a political personality, but does not reflect the opinions of the publishers of ELLE Canada. There is a lot to talk about there, Michelle. This idea of this phrase of opinions of a political personality. I know you wanted to talk about that. What grabbed your attention about it?
I mean, so many things. But also, first of all, when the changes were initially made, there was no note at all. So they just deleted Sarah Jama's profile from the story without an editor's note. Then there was a brief one. It's kind of gotten longer, but not better. So yeah, in there they have this really confusing phrase that the article had the opinions of a political personality. Mm-hmm. I mean, a political personality is not how I would refer to an MPP, like that's a politician. Yeah. So maybe they're referring to the writer of the piece, who's a journalist, a journalism professor. And, you know, so to call either of those women a political personality is, you know, first of all, to have such confusing language that it's not clear who they're referring to, it's a bad editor's note. But assuming they're referring to the writer of the piece, you know, to undermine her as a journalist and to say that her work suggests it's politically motivated, you know, we know that journalists face a lot of attacks and criticism online, especially if they're, you know, not white and male. You know, if they're from any kind of underrepresented background, they're often dismissed already as biased or kind of incapable of reporting fairly. And so intentionally or not, Elle's really playing into that by saying, like, well, this person who wrote the story is just a political personality, like they're disavowing her as a journalist. And they've couched it in this language of safety, of caring about the safety of everybody involved. But I really fail to see how that kind of undermining language makes the writer safer or the subjects of the article safer. It really feels like they're saying, stop yelling at us. We had nothing to do with this story being published, in a way, which is a wild thing to put out there.
That makes me think of two things. One is that, like, there is a world where the disclaimer and the edits just keep getting longer and longer. You know, like, it eventually just becomes longer than the actual article itself because you keep struggling to sort of make yourself clearer and clearer the next time. But two, there is so much muddiness here that I actually, like, interpreted that statement entirely differently than you, Michelle. I interpreted that as, like, they're referring to the politician, which, again, I would still not refer to the politician as a political personality. Matt, I mentioned earlier that ELLE Canada used this word disclaimer at the top of the article. Look, we have conventions for how revisions are made to magazine articles. They're usually a correction or an editor's note. You don't usually get a disclaimer. What do you make of this idea that they're like, you know, disclaimer before you read this thing, you need to know this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think, you know, I mean, it feels like an evasion to me. Like, I think, you know, like in a media sense, you're right. There's typically a generally accepted format in which publications tend to issue changes and revisions. This process is traditionally a lot more transparent than this, but it appears as though ELLE Canada, for whatever reason, decided against that. But yeah, I mean, this sounds to me to be like a retroactive evasion, which is unfortunate because I think the truth, whatever it was in this case, is likely to be far more compelling an explanation, you know, whether for better or worse. And so, like, not only have they betrayed this longstanding journalistic convention, but they've managed to do it in a way that makes sense to absolutely nobody.
Niko, what I'm really curious about here, okay, first of all, I'm just trying to, like, imagine the person who's listening to this conversation right now, and they're like, this is so confusing. And I would say to that person, I agree. That's how we ended up here in this first place. Like, there was confusion for a moment about whether the headline was changed. Some people thought that the word women was removed from it. By the way, we contacted the publisher, Sophie Banford, the publisher of ELLE Canada, for an interview. She wasn't available for an interview, but she gave us a statement, which includes, quote, the only changes to the piece's title was to remove the word 8. The term women was used in the title of the paper magazine and the title of Facebook and an X post, which linked to the article, but it was never there to begin with, so we did not remove it. Niko, this matters. And the reason this matters is because Vivek and Faye have seen a lot of transphobic backlash because of this article and how it played out online. Even if ELLE Canada did not remove the word women, there's this perception that because they made the changes after the backlash, that they maybe sort of agreed with the backlash or sort of like took a backtrack because of the backlash. Should they have been more clear about what they're standing by and what they're not standing by?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a real lack of clarity and just a real lack of, I'm going to say courage, and that's maybe a loaded word, but like there's no courage of convictions in this. Like if you make a list like this, that's about, you know, they use the words breaking the glass ceiling, which almost feels very like throwbacky to like what this kind of isn't. Because these are all like, everyone that's in this list is, you know, like they're a community member. They're doing a lot. They are, you know, it's not just like, these are famous women. These are women that are active in their communities that are working to, you know, build better communities around themselves and do work that matters. And, so with all of this, like if you're going to make lists like that, any list like this, there's going to be blowback. So you have to sort of go in being prepared to stand by the decisions you've made and to have concessions for that and to know how you're going to weather that and to immediately start making slapdash changes and not being clear about it and using muddy language. It just feels cowardly. And I hate to say that word, but it feels like there's no courage to stand by the convictions of your ideals in this sense, in which case it's all kind of a wash. Like now the whole thing is kind of ruined. We kind of also forget now that there's like 5 other women that are on this list that are no longer part of the conversation. Yeah. They're now sort of being dragged in this conversation because of, the way that so much hatred has been focused on these 3 women and their inclusion/exclusion. And it's just like, it just shows cowardice. Like you knew who was on this list. You had to be prepared to stand behind it no matter what. If you're putting it not only in the paper, it's on the cover of this month's issue. Like you've made it important, so treat it like it's important and treat the women that are in it and the person who wrote it, treat them all as important as they are. Like that part just really stands out to me. Like it's just cowardly.
Matt, in the scramble to sort of figure out what happened with this list, as there were changes that people were noticing. The Sarah Jama's profile disappears from the online piece. You see the scramble to rush to sort of like the Wayback Machine or the Internet Archive to go, can we retrieve like an older version of this article existing? Yeah. And there was so much like panic over like, well, this version has this, but this version doesn't have this. This version has this other correction. What does that tell you about the state of online journalism right now?
I think it underscores just how precarious all of this is. I think as we move further and further away from our more kind of traditional forms of doing things and come to rely more and more on the online press, I think we're beginning to see that like conventional forms of accountability are just no longer holding up. Like unlike a print piece with an online story, a publication like this can, I guess, believes as though they can just delete it from the web altogether, or they can publish something and quickly delete it and essentially hope that like an insignificant number of readers saw it. And so like in a broader sense, it clarifies that like we're all writing and reporting these things that will go on to live on online domains that we have little control over and can ostensibly be deleted at any time with very little oversight, And so like, we have also seen entire journalism archives deleted from the web. Like I'm thinking of MTV News, for example. Yeah. Like decades and decades of work. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Like just simply gone. Right. And so when your creative production or your creative output, I should say, fails to exist in like a material sense, it puts you as a writer, as a journalist, as a creative in a really vulnerable position. Right. And like, these just so happen to be the conditions of our lives now with online media, and we just have to figure out a way of negotiating that, I guess, really.
If folks are just joining us, my name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. Niko Stratis is here, Matt Amha is here, Michelle Cyca is here, and we're talking about what happened with this ELLE Canada story, this profile of 8 Canadian women who they have called the change makers, and then there's been all kinds of backlash and all kinds of changes to that piece. And Michelle, like I can forgive somebody listening to this conversation right now and thinking this is really muddy, but I also want to explain that like this really matters because we have a relationship with these magazines. We have a relationship with these institutions. They really shape our understanding of who we are and where we are. So if a magazine like ELLE Canada comes out and says, hey, look, these women matter and their stories matter, like that's significant. And those women began celebrating. They began celebrating on social media. It matters to their careers. It matters to their lives. Like that is really significant. But now the main change to the online version of this article is this profile of Sarah Jama. It has been removed entirely. I want to make it clear, this is not a show that is meant to talk about Sarah Jama. That's not the point of this. But instead, I want to talk about how she was removed from an article where she was featured as this like inspirational sort of change maker. Michelle, you've written magazine features before. How long would you say, how long would you guess this article took to sort of put together? Because it certainly wasn't, 4 days before.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this, and I don't think that I've ever worked on an article, certainly not like a feature-length story for a print magazine that's taken less than 3 or 4 months from, getting the assignment to shipping the issue. Yeah. Features are kind of what a magazine issue is built around. Like the things that go on the cover are like the the core parts of the issue, and then you might have like smaller pieces that got fit in around that. But a feature like this one, you know, there would be a lot of planning involved. And I think it's also, you know, identifying the people who were featured in it, those 8 incredible women, that's often something that the editors have in mind when they make the assignment. So, you know, nothing about this process is transparent, but it's possible that some or all of them were suggested by the editors to be featured. And then, you know, the writer would do the interviews and write the piece, and then it would be seen by a lot of people before being published, right? Like the managing editor, the editor-in-chief, the art director who has to figure out like the photos for everybody, the people doing layout, the copy editor. And I just say all that because, you know, there's a tone of sort of like surprise in that editor's note that was appended to the online version that kind of suggests that like maybe they didn't know the contents of the article. And I think it should be really clear that like everything in there was read and approved by many people. It was a joint decision. So to see the magazine kind of try and disavow it now is upsetting. You know, as Niko said, it really lacks courage.
Well, it may speak to maybe the preparation for the response to an article if it goes, you know, if an article like this goes up. I want to share a bit more of Sophie Banford's statement that she sent to us. She's the ELLE Canada publisher, and she said the decision wasn't made lightly to make the changes. She said, some members of our editorial team were targeted with threats due to this article. The safety and well-being of our journalists are our top priorities, and it is within this context that we made the decision to remove the content in question. Michelle, when you hear that statement, what do you take away from that statement by ELLE Canada?
I mean, as a journalist, I have so many questions, you know, like what kind of threats were made? Were they reported to police? Are they being investigated? Is it the recommended course of action that if a magazine receives hate mail or threats that they, you know, delete portions of articles? I would say that's probably an unusual strategy. But, you know, when I read that again, I wonder, like, whose safety are they concerned about? Like, as Matt said, you can't erase things from the internet. You can't eternal sunshine the previous version of this article from people's minds. It's out there. It's clearly riled up a lot of, like, hateful people. You know, we know Islamophobia and transphobia are, like, very active online, especially on X, where I've seen a lot of the backlash to this article. So I don't see how deleting it is going to stem that tide. From the perspective of the publishers, all it seems to do is demonstrate that if you harass a publication or its staff enough, you can get what you want. You can bully them into submission. So I fail to see how that makes anyone in the industry safer, or the people who work at ELLE, or you know, the journalist who wrote this piece, Sada Hassan, who hasn't spoken about this, so I'm not sure what her perspective on it is. I don't want to make any assumptions, but, you know, they sort of are closing the circle around the magazine to say we're protecting our journalists, but they also haven't made any statements speaking out against the transphobia that's been faced by Faye or Vivek, and they haven't said anything about the Islamophobia directed at Sarah Jama. So really, I wonder, like, whose safety are they concerned about here?
But you made an analogy to a decision made by the Emmys to our producers. Do you want to explain that analogy, like the difference between, like, maybe ELLE Canada and how, you know, the Emmys handled their situation? Do you want to explain that situation?
Yeah. So something I was thinking about with all of this was the Emmys recently announced their nominees, their finalists for awards, and one of them is Bizan from Gaza, who is a young woman who's been broadcasting from Gaza on the ground over the last 11 months, and she's a finalist in the news and documentary category. And very predictably at this point, there's been a backlash to that from many powerful people, including celebrities who, you know, wrote a letter to the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences to say that her nomination should be revoked. And you know, at this point, media organizations, especially one like, you know, ELLE, who have been around for a while, they understand backlash will come when you feature people who attract a lot of hate. And what the Emmys did is they came out with a letter explaining their decision, saying, like, we're not revoking this nomination. It was reviewed by our judges. It met the criteria. We're standing behind it. Essentially just coming out and saying, like, we're not going to change our minds. You know, we made this decision deliberately. And I think that is sort of the course of action that should be taken when you're not talking about a piece of media that's fraudulent or inaccurate, where there's like a problem editorially with the integrity of it. You're just talking about backlash. Like, media outlets need to be prepared for that. They have no excuse not to be when it's as predictable as this. And there was a different path forward for ELLE here that they could have taken.
Matt, I think like one reality here is that like the writer's byline has been removed from the online version of the article, as well as Sarah Jama's profile. We still don't know who to go to ask questions right now. We don't know whose decision that was. How is all of that sitting with you?
So I think there are like journalistic concerns around that, right? And I think that we've kind of managed to talk about some of that. But I think where my mind goes immediately is like, I think the most pernicious element of this in some way is the way that two young Muslim women of color have been pitted against one another. And I think like in that vein, this goes to represent kind of Canadian media writ large and the relationship that a lot of us have to these newsrooms. I think like, this piece was authored by a young Muslim woman of color, a woman that I can only imagine has had to like rebel and fight against the system in different ways just to be able to survive. And, these are the very kinds of journalists who are used to help newsrooms gain access into communities they would otherwise not find accessible. So, a woman that like the woman responsible for this piece kind of did exactly that. And these are the repercussions that we've been left with, And so I think like, in some sense, it's a betrayal of the highest order, but it's a really familiar betrayal. And if I can just say too, like, what this also represents to me is the fact that our place in these newsrooms, and I'm talking now as a young journalist of color myself, is incredibly tenuous. Like these publications, many of which are now like vehicles for content, they might permit your integration for a time under very specific conditions. But as soon as those conditions are violated by like elements of your experience, which might make them feel uncomfortable, you're going to very quickly realize that it was likely, you were never thought to belong in the first place. Like your acceptance into these rooms, onto these mastheads is contingent on your ability not to shake the table too much, right? And so like certain dissent might be permitted, certain kinds of ideas might be permitted, but the second you're digging too deep into your own experience, all of a sudden we have a problem on our hands, right? And so like there's this like performative kind of activism, I think, that like generally is going on in this industry and has been, frankly, for a number of years now. Like the illusion of progressivism is a very lucrative cottage industry, and it's something that like all mainstream legacy publications in this country, or a large number of them, are investing in some way, and investing in marketing yourself as kind of open-minded and diverse. And so this crisis of their own making on the part of ELLE Canada, I think, really reveals the limits of that progressivism and just how ingenuine it can be.
Niko, I want to get back to the fact that two trans women were featured in this list, Faye and Vivek. Vivek's a friend of Commotion. She's guest hosted the show. She's guest hosted Q. We wanted to check in to see how she was doing. And Vivek talked about the personal impact that all of this is taking. And I just want to read you this quote from her. She said, "I don't want to speak on behalf of Faye, Sarah, or Sadaf, the writer, but I can say that on my end, seeing thousands of comments from all around the world that include older pre-transition photos of me with cruel comments about my face, body, and body hair has certainly taken a toll. It's also disturbing to see a piece that I think was intended to be joyful and celebratory ended up being one that has actually highlighted who is, quote, unworthy of celebration, i.e. those speaking out about Palestine and trans people." That's the end of Vivek's quote there. Niko, when you hear Vivek's thoughts, what comes to mind for you?
I mean, that's a very real and understood pain. I'm a trans woman. A thing that happens if you're a trans woman that exists in public at all is that there are these people that have cataloged your entire life before you transition somehow. They have photos of you, they have your dead name, they have information. And anytime they want to, they will drag the stuff out of the trash to remind you that they know who you used to be. Because heaven forbid we continue to be different people in the present like everybody else is afforded the opportunity to. And this is the thing that happens a lot with Faye and Vivek both. I see it happen time and again. And it is because they are both very public figures and they are very proud of who they are. And there's nothing more terrifying to these sorts of people than somebody who is proud of who they are in the present and is doing good work to be the sort of person they want to be in the present. This is a list that is supposed to be honoring people that are doing exactly that. And the spirit of it has been so incredibly tainted by this sort of kowtowing to this sort of hatred and sort of just like bitter, vile behavior that is like it happened like clockwork. You put 2 trans women on your list, you know those people are sending you emails. You know the names of the people that are going to be emailing you because it's the same people every time. And I see that and I think, right, this has happened to me before. This has happened to every other trans woman I know who exists in public, especially if you're a trans woman being honored as a woman. Heaven forbid that we get included at all, because this sort of thing will happen. And it's shameful that they didn't know that this would happen and were prepared to stand up for these people instead of forcing them to sort of weather these personal attacks and to feel like I'm sure Vivek and Faye both do right now, which is the exact opposite of the spirit of that thing. And Sarah Jama too, like, and again, everybody else in the list, I'm sure is just like, well, this thing doesn't feel the way it's intended, which is supposed to be celebratory. You know, I read Vivek's note and it just broke my heart because I know that feeling. And it's a thing that happens to all of us. Me being on this show, talking about this and claiming status as a trans woman at all, I'm going to get emails about it. You guys are probably going to get emails about it. This happens to me every time I tell people that I'm trans because often they forget. And when they forget, I skate by. But as soon as they remember, I am reminded. And it sucks. It's really hard.
Thank you for sharing that pain. And I'm sorry that that is like a consequence that happens as a result of you coming on the show every time to talk about this, but also I'm glad that you're here to talk about it. Niko Stratis, Matthew Amha, Michelle Cyca, thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thanks, man.
Of course, anytime. Niko Stratis is a culture critic who writes the newsletter Anxiety Shark. She's in Toronto. Michelle Cyca is a journalist and member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Vancouver. Matt Amha is a journalist and culture critic based in Toronto. And that is it for the show today. Remember, if you're listening to this show as a podcast, give us a follow wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube and on Instagram. We are at Commotion CBC. I'm Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This is Commotion. I'll see you tomorrow.